Hey party people, welcome to Movies in a Bottle. Today we are breaking down The Green Mile. This is an emotional, thought-provoking movie that delves into the complexities of human nature and challenges your typical notions of good and evil. Stick around to learn all about the events of John Coffey on The Green Mile, and as always, I'll be sharing some trivia and fun facts along the way. So I usually save all the bonus feature content for the actual breakdown, but on this one I wanted to start with some context. While Frank Darabont was doing The Shawshank Redemption in '94, Stephen King gave him this 30-second elevator pitch on what would be The Green Mile. And in response to people skipping to the end of his books and reading the end to see if they like it, Stephen King actually released this one in serial installments like a Charles Dickens novel. So when Frank Darabont was reading that, and before it got to the end, based on that 30-second elevator pitch he had gotten, he said he wanted to be the one to adapt The Green Mile onto film. And Stephen King later actually said that this was his most faithful adaptation, so with that context, I'm not going to spend any time on differences with the book. Final quick note, this movie's 3 hours long, so in an effort to spare editor JK's sanity, I'm less moment to moment than normal, but let me know if you like it any more or less. Roll film.
We hop around a few timelines in this movie, but we briefly begin with an angry mob of people storming their way through the woods. One of them is shouting a couple of names, then a disembodied voice whispers, "You love your sister? You make a noise, you know what happens." More on that later. We see Paul Edgecombe going about his daily routine in his senior living facility, and he clearly gets along with everyone, but he seems rather close with fellow resident Elaine. While grabbing some breakfast one day, a friendly orderly asks Paul where he goes every day on his long walks. Paul explains that he simply likes to walk, and the orderly just tells him to be careful, and he sneaks him an extra piece of toast for his daily journey. Paul dons his red raincoat and goes on his walk, and he eventually makes his way to a rundown shed. Again, more on that later. That night, Paul is sitting with his friend Elaine while everyone is watching some TV. She noticed that he was a little off today, but he reassures her that he just didn't sleep well. But then a resident changes the channel to an old movie in the middle of singing the line, "I'm in heaven," from an old movie called Top Hat from 1935. Paul is overwhelmed by the memories as they come flooding in, and Elaine notices him tearing up, so they leave so they can talk about it. Paul said he hasn't spoken about these things in nearly 60 years, but starts to open up about all of his time as a supervisor on death row. He recalls a few things, like instead of calling their death row the last mile, theirs was the Green Mile on account of the fated floor. Their electric chair was called Old Sparky, and the year 1935 was the year of John Coffey and the two dead girls. Turning the clock back to 1935, we see the guards in the Green Mile getting their new prisoner. Paul, obviously much younger now, is trying to finish his business in the restroom before the new prisoner arrives, and he is clearly struggling, but he's too stubborn to see a doctor about it. Percy obnoxiously shouts, "Dead man walkin'," as he escorts an enormous man to the Green Mile, but when Paul takes over, he makes sure to send the insufferable Percy away to welcome their new inmate. Percy is pretty obviously the odd one out, and in a fit of anger, he breaks another inmate, Dell's, hand as he stomps away. Despite the man's size, Paul does his usual welcoming process in the cell, and he meets the surprisingly polite and soft-spoken John Coffey. It's like the drink, only not spelled the same. After their short and sweet introduction, John's only question is if they'll keep the light on, because he's afraid of the dark in new places. Paul puts him at ease by saying that they keep the lights on, and the two men shake hands. As Paul leaves, John cryptically says that he tried to take it back, but it was too late.
It was actually Bruce Willis that told Michael Clark Duncan about The Green Mile and called Frank Darabont to say that he found his John Coffey. Why not?
Back in the office, the guards make sure to have Dell's hand checked, and Brutal warns Paul about how he's going to be chewed out for sending Percy away earlier. Then they start talking about John, and Paul gets to reading his file. We jump back a bit and see an unthinkable tragedy happen to a family one peaceful morning. Screams pierce the air as the mother realizes that her girls are gone, and soon the father and the rest of the town are looking for him. Their chase leads them to the banks of a shallow creek where John Coffey is holding the girls, now covered in blood. The mob rushes over, and the grief-stricken father naturally starts punching John. Again, he says that he tried to take it back, but it was too late. The actor playing John Coffey, Michael Clark Duncan, said that he was scared for his life on every single take during this scene. The warden, Hal Moores, interrupts Paul's reading, and Paul asks about his wife. Hal says that she's going to the hospital to see about her constant headaches, and he hands him some paperwork on the new inmate. Paul correctly suspects that he's not here just for the trivial paperwork, and Hal confesses that he got an angry call from Percy's aunt, who happens to be the governor's wife. Then, just as Brutal warned, Hal scolds Paul for sending him away. But Hal is sympathetic to Paul, telling him that he may only have to keep the peace for just a little bit longer because Percy's put in a request to work at Briar Ridge. He's basically guaranteed anywhere he wants to go with his connections. They suspect that the only reason why he hasn't left yet is because the evil guy wants to watch an execution up close. Paul can't sleep, so his wife Jan comes to check on him. He says that not only is he worried about Hal and Melinda, but he's also pondering about what he read about the new inmate and how God can allow such things to happen. She invites him to bed, but he declines declines because his waterworks are still all messed up and he's still too stubborn to see a doctor about it. Dean and Paul are touching up old Sparky when Brutal laughs and calls for them. He jokes and says that they finally hired a new guard as a curious little mouse crawls out from under the restraint room. Brutal and Paul like the little fella, so Brutal feeds him, but Dean is against it. The mouse finally decides to hide back in the restraint room, and when they decide enough is enough and then clear it, they can't seem to find him. The next day, it's the rest of the crew's turn to see the mouse. The only sound to be heard is Percy's annoying whistling when the mouse comes out. And just like the others, they feed him, and everyone is in awe until Percy yells and throws his nightstick, then chases him all the way back into the restraint room. Paul and Brutal hear the ruckus and rush over to see what's going on, but allow Percy to keep looking for the mouse, if only to keep him busy for a while. After he clears the small room, the men have a word with Percy to tell him to treat the inmates better. He callously tells everyone that he sees this place as a bucket of urine to drown rats, but after hearing that, Brutal's had enough and he shoves Percy, but Paul pulls him off. Then, regardless of his connections, Paul puts Percy in his place for having threatened one of his men. An inmate, Arlen, gets a visit from his family, so Paul uses this time to practice the upcoming execution. The custodian, too, is a stand-in for Arlen, and he couldn't be taking his job any less seriously. At one point, he jokes and gets the men laughing so hard that Paul has to rein him in and reminds them of the seriousness of their jobs. The men are moving like a well-oiled machine, but Percy is only there to learn, so he's sidelined behind the barrier where the man that flips the switch is. Percy sees Brutal place the sponge on Toot's head, and he asks about it. He's told it's to make sure that the inmate passes quickly and to never throw the switch without it. As they wrap it up, Brutal jokes with Paul that the witness showed up early, and he sees the mouse scurry away.
Stephen King visited during filming, and he wanted to be strapped into old Sparky, so they did, and Frank Darabont jokingly negotiated the adaptation for the next 3 movies that he wanted, and it was also around his birthday, so they had this gigantic cake with the Green Mile on it.
Before the execution, Paul sits with Arlen and the two discuss their beliefs in the Christian heaven, but they have to end their conversation because, well, it's time. They go through the actual process now. They strap him in, wet the sponge, flip the switch, but horrifically, it isn't enough, so they have to flip the switch a second time. It's awful, but Percy watches on with the rest of the witnesses. Percy pisses Brutal off whenever he slaps Arlen's body around, so he pushes Percy away, saying Arlen's square with the house and not to touch him. After Brutal is wheeled off, Paul gets to brass tacks and asks Percy why doesn't he take that job from Briar Ridge. Percy proposes that he just might if Paul lets him be up front in Brutal's spot for the next execution. Later on, the guards gather to see why the Cajun inmate Dell is laughing so hard. Somehow he's managed to tame that mouse and he named him Mr. Jingles. John sees him doing tricks like fetching the spool and he comments that he must be a circus mouse. But the air is sucked out of the room whenever Percy shows up. To everyone's surprise though, he has a kind idea of getting Mr. Jingles a cigar box with cotton padding.
I've seen a few conflicting reports, but anywhere between 12 and 15 mice played Mr. Jingles, and they usually used laser pointers to guide him around everywhere.
Paul is called into Hal's office to get a briefing on their dangerous new prisoner, Wild Bill Wharton, but Paul can tell something else is distressing his friend, and without words, Hal says that he got Melinda's diagnosis. It is an inoperable brain tumor, and he cannot bring himself to tell his wife. That night, Paul is up late staring at his wife while reflecting on Hal's words when his urinary infection flares up dramatically. He can't even make it to the outhouse before relieving himself in the yard, so the next morning he tells Jan that he's throwing in the towel and seeing the doctor after he gets in the new inmate. Speaking of, Harry, Dean, and Percy go to the hospital to transfer Wild Bill, and he's so incredibly sedated that the guards have to change his clothes and drag him around to move him. Paul is waiting on the mile looking dreadful when John asks to see him. Paul doesn't have time though as Wild Bill is almost here, and as everyone arrives, John cautions for him to be careful. All hell breaks loose because Wild Bill was just pretending to be drugged. He quickly holds Dean as a hostage when Paul's gun is trained on them, and Percy's frozen like a deer in headlights. As things reach a fever pitch, Brutal finally shows up and uses Percy's own nightstick to knock out Bill. Paul sends everyone off to get checked on and report the event, but he collapses as soon as they're gone. John insists that he still needs to talk to him, so Paul musters the energy to hobble over there, and he hesitantly takes his hand. When he does, John pulls him close and hovers his hand over his infected area. Dell screams for help as the lights overhead burst and John releases Paul. Paul calms Dell down, but notices something is wrong with John. Somehow he coughs out a huge swarm of bugs, saying that he helped Paul, but now he's tired and passes out. Paul cannot believe what just happened, but finds out John wasn't lying after finally taking a whiz without it feeling like razor blades. Then he takes Jan up on her offer from a couple nights ago. 4 times, in fact. Eyebrows, eyebrows. The next morning, Paul comes clean about everything that happened yesterday and calls in sick from work so that he could learn more about John. He goes out to John's lawyer and beats around the bush a little bit before asking about his past. But there isn't much to know. He basically dropped from the sky and doesn't have a history of any kind, let alone a violent one. The lawyer then susses out that he isn't here to see if John killed before, but if he killed at all. Then he goes on to compare John to a lovable stray dog that snapped one day and blinded his son. He cautions that one day John is gonna snap too. Back on the Green Mile, Paul delivers John some cornbread as a thanks from Jan, and he's even nice enough to give Dell and Mr. Jingles some, and I love that Mr. Jingles gets his own full piece. But then Wild Bill lives up to his name. He shouts a slur at John and spits on Paul when he comes over to tell him to be civil. Paul makes it clear that this one is a freebie, but Wild Bill goes on to pee on Harry. I don't know where Wild Bill gets a nickel, but he uses it to buy a moon pie from Toot, then he spits it all over Brutal. They've had enough, so Harry gets his revenge by fire hosing Bill and they make proper use of that restraint room. I didn't really understand this when I watched it as a kid, but the guards do Dell a kindness when it's his turn. Since Dell is simple-minded, the guards spare his feelings by staging a show for him and Mr. Jingles so they can go through the practice execution routine, but with Percy leading this time. Everything goes fine, but Percy scares Dell on his way back to his cell, causing him to fall. Percy tries to apologize, but Bill suddenly grabs him by the neck. Paul threatens to shoot, so Bill lets go, but Percy's so scared that he wets himself in front of everyone. Paul comforts him, saying that what happens on the mile stays there, but Dell keeps laughing at him anyways. Paul, Brood, and Dell are discussing who's going to take Mr. Jingles while Dell is practicing the spool trick. Nowhere seems to satisfy Dell until Brutal thinks on his feet and proposes the made-up circus down in Florida called Mouseville. Paul picks up on the deception and joins in, and Dell finally seems happy at a place for Mr. Jingles. They keep practicing, but he throws an errant shot and Mr. Jingles has to run out of the cell, and Percy does something truly horrible and crushes the little guy. Dell cries out in pain as everyone watches with heavy hearts, but John Coffey asks for Paul to give him the mouse because there still might be time. To everyone's confusion, he does, and just like before with Paul, he performs another miracle by breathing life back into the little Mr. Jingles. Also like before, he chokes up insects before giving the mouse back to the immensely grateful owner. Percy finally crossed the line, so Paul and Brutal go back to confront him. They wound his pride by telling him that Mr. Jingles is still alive, and when he stomps back in, they pin him to the chair and make him own up to his deal. He goes up front for Dell's execution, and then he transfers, or else him being a coward when Wild Bill attacked will go on his work record. Percy reluctantly agrees, and soon enough, it's time. Dell lets John hold Mr. Jingles, and he makes sure Paul and Brutal meant what they said about Mouseville, and in French he says, "Goodbye, I love you, little one." They strap him in, and his final words, he shows remorse, asks God for mercy, and makes Paul promise about Mouseville one more time. In an act of cruelty, Percy breaks it to him that they made it all up, and then a final act of cruelty, the monster doesn't wet the sponge. Paul notices the lack of water trail, but it's too late. The switch is flipped. All they can do now is let it run its course, but Paul makes Percy watch the horror that he caused. John is trying to hold Mr. Jingles, but because of his abilities, he feels everything and drops Mr. Jingles, who hides in the restraint room once again. Percy cowardly tries to say he didn't know the sponge needed to be wet, but Brutal does what we all want to do right now and attacks Percy with all of his might. Hal comes down to chew everyone out and demands answers. Paul subtly implies that it was Percy's fault, but he's willing to minimize things for Percy to fulfill his part of the deal and transfer to Briar Ridge. Afterwards, Paul checks on John, and he says that he lost Mr. Jingles and he doesn't think he's coming back this time since he felt everything through him. Paul and Jan go to visit Hal and his wife Melinda, but it's hard for them since she's not really herself anymore due to her condition. He has another sleepless night thinking about Hal and Melinda and how he doesn't know what he'd do if it was Jane instead. But he has a plan and he invites the fellas over for breakfast. There he brings up the miracle with Mr. Jingles and admits that John healed his infection too. They connect the dots and realize he's thinking about breaking John out to cure Melinda. Paul confirms the plan, and they're initially skeptical until Paul rolls that one per episode nat 20, and he says he doesn't think John is guilty at all, but agrees to do what must be done if something goes wrong. On the mile, John somehow knows the plan and says he's ready, but the guys have to deal with a couple of things. First, Wild Bill is simple enough. They trick him with a little bit of reverse psychology, a lot of bit of sedatives, and some cola. Next, the crew bursts into the office while Percy is reading some questionable material alone, and Brutal overpowers him so the rest can force him into a straitjacket. Percy throws out his usual threats, but they go on ahead and toss him into the restraint room to reflect on what he did to Dell. Now it's go time. They arm themselves, go over the details once more, and load out. But that dang Wild Bill isn't out just yet, and he grabs John's arm as he walks by. Lights burst above, and John winces at whatever he's experiencing through Wild Bill. Then Bill actually passes out this time so they can sneak out. They have a truck hidden in the woods nearby, and they get to Melinda's house, and somehow John knows they broke him out to help her. They get to the house, and Hal panics and then nearly fires away on John in his confusion. John is unfazed and slowly moves past everyone to tell Hal that he's here to help Melinda, who's yelling for him in agony inside. Paul tells Hal to trust him, and they cautiously follow John up to Melinda. At first, she shouts awful things since he isn't herself anymore, but she's more at ease when John sits with her. She asks for his name, and he says his usual phrase, John Coffey, like the drink but not spelt the same. He then says he can see it and starts to perform another miracle while Hal stares in disbelief. The lights glow like before, but instead of coughing out the bugs like last time, John starts choking and pretends he's fine. Hal sits with Melinda, who's healthy again, but she doesn't remember anything beyond driving to get the tests done. Hal is just at a loss for words, but Paul helps him by saying that the test said that she didn't have a tumor. Upon hearing these words spoken aloud, Hal breaks down in Melinda's arms. John struggles to get up and reintroduce himself to Melinda, but she recognizes him this time and musters the strength to walk over to him. She tells John that she dreamt of him. They were both wandering in the darkness, but they found each other. She then gives him a necklace from around her neck of St. Christopher to keep him safe. She thanks him and hugs him, but they have to go.
Sorry to break up a tender moment, but I found it a bit more than coincidental that she had the necklace on her, unless it's common for people at the end to have a necklace of St. Christopher, the Saint of Travelers, on them. But you let me know down below.
On the way out, Brutal tells Paul he doesn't think John is going to make it to Old Sparky. He swallowed that stuff for a reason, but Paul says that it's his choice and he's earned that much. Much to Dean's relief, they get back in time before Wild Bill wakes up and they give him the good news on Melinda. Time to deal with Percy. They go into the room and take his tape off, and he acts predictably and demands to be let out. Paul slaps him harder than the like button and tells him he's going to take his punishment for Dell like a man. He goes on to threaten him that if he tells anyone, he's going to talk about the sabotaged execution, peeing himself, and everything. But not only that, they will beat him within an inch of his life if he talks. But after everything that's happened on the mile, it can still stay on the mile if he keeps his end of the deal. Percy sheds a single tear and politely asks if he may be let out of the coat, and they quickly release him. Percy says he intends to think everything over and takes a moment to collect himself when suddenly John grabs him by the neck and pulls him close. Everyone is just freaking out at this point, but they ease up when they see John releasing the swarm of insects into Percy's mouth. Percy seems to be in like a trance-like state, and without saying a word, he shuffles over to the very groggy Wild Bill. Then we get the most satisfying two birds, one stone, with Percy, still without saying anything, shooting Wild Bill. Everyone tackles Percy, and he finally coughs up the insects. Paul walks down to ask John why he did that, and he explains that Billy was a bad man. He saw it when he grabbed his arm. Then John says he wants to give Paul a part of his gift so he can see what Billy had done too. Paul takes his hand, and then pain and misery wash over him as he sees into the past. We see the farmer who led the angry mob after John, and we also see the two girls happily playing. Their mama calls them all in for supper, and we see that the evil Wild Bill was also there. That night he stuck into their rooms and threatened if one screams he'll hurt the other. John tells Paul that he used their love against each other, and that's how the world really is, every day. Soon Hal and some other officials are there to investigate, and Hal is willing to cover for Paul, but he wants to know if it involves the breakout. And to spare his friend's feelings again, Paul lies and says that they weren't related. Meanwhile, Percy's cheese has slid off his cracker, so in a twist of karmic justice, he ends up at Briar Ridge Mental Hospital after all. Paul's up late into the night contemplating what must be done soon. Jan joins him and they decide that since Hal can't help John, he should never have to bear knowing that he was innocent. There are things that Paul's done in his life that he isn't proud of, but this is the first time that he's felt real danger of going to hell. Jan gives him some sound advice, telling him to talk to John, ask what he wants. Paul and Brutal pay John a visit to go over the final details and his last meal request, since they only have a couple of days now. John wants meatloaf, mashed taters, gravy, okra, and then some Jan's fine cornbread if she doesn't mind. Not gonna lie, that's a good meal. But with all the sincerity in his heart, Paul asks John what does he want him to do. He's willing to let him go because whenever he meets his maker, he can't bring himself to say that he killed one of God's true miracles because it was simply his job. John says that he can tell the Father that it was a kindness because he is tired of feeling alone, directionless, and mostly he's tired of people being ugly to each other. To him, that hate and pain is like glass in his head, so he wants it to stop.
In the making of, Frank Darabont said the heart of the movie was captured in this scene. He said Tom Hanks was off camera giving Michael Clarke Duncan an Academy Award-winning performance to help him. And later on, when Michael was congratulating Hanks at an award ceremony, he said he's always going to remember him for the best performances off-screen.
Brutal insists that there must be something that he wants, and John admits that he's never seen a flicker show. We see John watching the "I'm in heaven" scene from the 1935 movie Top Hat, and he is totally mesmerized. He's even calling them angels. And for what it's worth, his amusement seems to bring the fellas some small measure of comfort. It's finally time, and the guys gather to escort John to Old Sparky. John makes sure to tell everyone not to worry. He's gonna be okay soon. Paul hangs on to the St. Christopher necklace for now, and John says that he had a nice dream this afternoon. He dreamt that Mr. Jingles made it to Mouseville after all, and he, the two girls, and a bunch of people were cheering there too. John is stricken with fear as he enters the execution room, but his friends do their best to comfort him and hold themselves together as they prepare things. John mutters the line, "I'm in heaven," as they work, but when they start to don the hood over him, John pleads for them not to cover him because he's afraid of the dark. Of course, Paul obliges, but when it's time, he cannot bring himself to give that final order. After waiting what feels like forever, he shakes John's hand one final time and he hears his voice again saying that he killed them with their love, and that's how it is all over. As tears swell in the guards' faces, Paul gives the final order and lights explode everywhere as John passes on. Afterwards, Paul takes a moment to grieve and return the necklace before Brutal wheels him away. Back in the present day, Paul finishes his story by saying that was the last execution he or Brutal ever took part in, but Elaine is a bit skeptical. She doesn't think Paul would lie, but the numbers don't really add up. Then, with a curious look on his face, he asks if she's up for taking a walk, and he takes her out to that old shed. He kneels over an old cigar box and whispers for his friend to wake up, and now, with slow movements, a little gray Mr. Jingles wakes up to see his friend. Paul speaks some French, and the mouse does the spool trick for a nice piece of bread. It wasn't the Mouseville that they had in mind, but it'll do. Paul explains that he thinks Mr. Jingles was an accident when everything went so horribly wrong with Dell's execution, but his life was extended due to John making him see Wild Bill's visions. Then Paul confesses to being an astonishing 108 years old, and Elaine is shocked. But Paul defends John by saying that he was just a force of nature, and he's seen a lot of amazing things, but he's also cursed to see all of his loved ones pass on, and soon he'll watch her pass on too. Sure enough, Paul is at her funeral thinking about his life and how one day he will surely die too, and as he leaves he recalls his final walk down the mile when Mr. Jingles came out from under the restraint room so Paul could scoop him up. He finishes his lonely walk at his retirement home and thinks about all the people he's lost, but one thought scares him the most. If John made a little mouse live this long, how much longer does he have? And sometimes the Green Mile seems oh so long ago.
That is a chilling final line. So the director thinks John Coffey is more of a stand-in for the visionaries we can't help but to snuff out, and he alludes to Jesus, Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr. But the actor thinks he's more like everything good in the world, like helping an old lady cross the street. And I remember watching this movie when I was like 10, and certainly leaning more towards the actor, thinking he's everything good, but now that I'm older, I think I lean more towards Frank Darabont's interpretation, but I want to know what you think. Let me know down below. Okay, I have talked more than enough about the Green Mile. Let me know what you guys think, and let me know what movie you want me to add to the list, and as always, subscribe and ring the bell for a recap next week. Y'all be good. Take care.